In March of 2021, a climate research team from the European Space Agency was analyzing satellite thermal imaging data of Antarctica when they noticed something that shouldn't have been there. Dr. Elena Christensen, a Danish glaciologist leading the analysis, was examining temperature patterns across the East Antarctic ice sheet when her software flagged an anomaly. There was a geometric heat signature approximately 200 kilometers inland from the coast, a pattern of straight lines and right angles emerging from beneath ice that was supposed to be over 2 kilometers thick. The pattern was faint, barely above the threshold of detection, but it was unmistakably artificial in its regularity. Dr. Christensen ran the analysis 3 more times, checking for equipment malfunction or data corruption. So the pattern remained consistent. She expanded her search parameters and discovered something even more disturbing. There were more of these geometric heat signatures scattered across Antarctica. 14 distinct locations showed similar patterns, straight lines, rectangular formations, and in 2 cases what appeared to be circular structures of enormous size. All of them were beneath the ice. All of them were emitting slightly more thermal energy than the surrounding terrain. And all of them were in locations where, according to every geological survey and historical record, nothing artificial should exist. Christensen prepared a preliminary report and submitted it to her superiors at the ESA. Within 48 hours, she was summoned to a meeting in Brussels. Said the meeting was not with her usual supervisors, but with officials she had never met. Individuals who identified themselves as representing various European government agencies without providing specific details about their roles. They told Christensen that her discovery was significant but classified. They told her that the thermal signatures she had detected were already known to certain organizations. And most disturbing of all, they told her that what she had discovered was not new. It had been mapped before. In 1938, the officials showed Christensen a set of documents that they said had been recovered from German archives after World War II. The documents included maps of Antarctica created by a German expedition in 1938, maps that showed not just coastlines and geographical features, but structures. Yet artificial structures in locations that matched, with remarkable precision, the thermal anomalies Christensen had just discovered using satellite technology 83 years later. The maps had been classified immediately upon recovery and had remained classified for over 7 decades. Christensen's rediscovery of the same structures using modern technology had forced a decision point. The information could no longer be completely suppressed. If you've ever suspected that the most important discoveries about our world are kept hidden from public awareness, if you're ready to examine evidence that challenges everything we've been told about human history and about what exists beneath the ice at the bottom of the world, then I need you to do something for me right now. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and share this video with people who understand that the truth is often stranger and more disturbing than the comfortable lies we're fed. Because what I'm about to reveal connects a Nazi expedition from 1938 to satellite discoveries in 2021, and the implications are so profound that governments have spent 8 decades trying to keep them secret. Dr. Christensen was told that she could continue her research, but that any findings related to the anomalies would need to be submitted for security review before publication. She was also told, in language that left no ambiguity, that discussing her discovery outside authorized channels would have severe professional and possibly legal consequences. Christensen agreed to the terms, but she was deeply troubled by the encounter. She was a scientist. And in the idea that scientific discoveries could be suppressed for political or security reasons violated everything she believed about the free exchange of knowledge. She began her own private investigation trying to understand what the 1938 German expedition had actually found and why it remained classified after all these decades. What Christensen uncovered through careful research and through contacts in the historical and intelligence communities who were willing to share information off the record forms the basis of this investigation. The German maps from 1938 were not simple geographical surveys. They were detailed architectural documentation of structures that should not exist, structures that were already ancient when the Germans found them. Structures that modern satellite technology is now confirming are real and are still emitting energy after thousands or possibly millions of years beneath the Antarctic ice. The official history of German Antarctic exploration in the late 1930s centers on the Neuschwabenland expedition, named after the ship that carried the German team to Antarctica between December 1938 and April 1939. The expedition was led by Captain Alfred Richer and included scientists, military personnel, and support staff totaling 57 individuals. The stated purpose was to establish German territorial claims in Antarctica, to conduct geographical and meteorological research, and to scout for whaling grounds and other resources that could support German economic interests. Yeah, this official narrative is not entirely false. The expedition did conduct geographical surveys, did establish territorial markers, and did investigate resource potential. But according to documents that Dr. Christensen's sources provided to her, documents that came from Allied intelligence archives that captured German records after the war, the Neuschwabenland expedition had another purpose that was never publicly acknowledged. The Germans were looking for something specific. They had intelligence from sources that remain unclear even in the captured documents, that Antarctica contained structures of ancient origin that demonstrated advanced architectural and possibly technological capabilities. The expedition's real mission was to locate these structures, document them, and determine whether they could be accessed or exploited. The intelligence the Germans possessed came from multiple sources. One source was previous expeditions to Antarctica conducted by other nations, particularly Norwegian and British expeditions in the 1920s and early 1930s. These expeditions had reported geographical anomalies and had occasionally encountered exposed rock formations that showed unusual characteristics. Some expedition members had described features that seemed too regular to be natural formations, but these observations were not pursued because the scientific establishment of the time had no framework for interpreting artificial structures in Antarctica as anything other than impossible. Another source of intelligence was more esoteric and more controversial. German researchers in the 1930s, but particularly those connected with organizations like the Thule Society and the Ahnenerbe, were deeply interested in ancient civilizations and in evidence of advanced knowledge existing in prehistory. These organizations had compiled collections of ancient texts, maps, and artifacts that supposedly contained information about lost civilizations. Among these materials were references to a southern land where ancient peoples had established cities before a catastrophic climate change had buried them beneath ice. Whether these references were genuine ancient sources or whether they were misinterpretations and forgeries created to support ideological narratives is still debated. But what's not debatable is that the Nazi leadership took them seriously enough to fund an expensive and dangerous expedition to Antarctica, specifically to search for evidence of ancient structures. The expedition was equipped not just with geographical survey equipment, but with ground-penetrating instruments, with drilling capabilities for ice and rock, and with photographic and documentation equipment far exceeding what a simple territorial claim expedition would require. The Neuschwabenland expedition departed from Hamburg on December 17, 1938. The voyage south took approximately 3 weeks, and the ship reached the Antarctic coast in early January 1939. The expedition established a base camp on the coast and began systematic aerial surveys of the interior using 2 seaplanes that the ship carried. Between January and March of 1939, these aircraft conducted dozens of survey flights, photographing approximately 600,000 square kilometers of Antarctic territory. The photographs from these flights have been partially released over the decades since the war, and they show remarkable geographical detail given the technology of the era. But according to the documents Dr. Christensen obtained, significant portions of the photographic record have never been released. The suppressed photographs reportedly show features that the expedition's analysts identified as potentially artificial, geometric patterns on the ground that suggested construction rather than natural geological formation, and in several cases partially exposed structures where ice had receded or where wind had cleared snow from underlying features. The expedition also conducted ground surveys, teams that ventured inland from the base camp to investigate features that the aerial photographs had identified as worthy of closer examination. It was during these ground surveys that the expedition made its most significant discoveries, and that the maps were created that would remain classified for over 80 years. The maps created by the 1938 German expedition exist in multiple versions. The versions that have been publicly released show geographical features, coastlines, mountain ranges, and ice formations. Yet these maps are impressive examples of cartographic work from the period and have been cited in various historical studies of Antarctic exploration. But these public versions are sanitized. The complete maps, the ones that remain classified and that Dr. Christensen's sources allowed her to see, contain far more information. They show structures. The structures appear on the maps as precise architectural drawings, not artistic interpretations or speculative reconstructions, but actual surveyed buildings or facilities that the German expedition observed and documented. The maps show foundations, walls, entrances, and in some cases internal layouts of structures that were partially accessible through ice caves or through areas where geothermal activity had melted through the overlying ice. Yet the structures are drawn with the attention to detail of professional architectural documentation, including measurements, orientations, and notes about construction materials and techniques. Dr. Christensen described seeing these maps as one of the most extraordinary experiences of her scientific career. The structures documented on them were unmistakably artificial, showing right angles, symmetrical layouts, and construction techniques that demonstrated sophisticated engineering. But they were in locations where no known human civilization had ever existed, beneath ice sheets that geological evidence suggested had been in place for hundreds of thousands of years. The structures were either incredibly ancient, built during a period when Antarctica's climate was dramatically different, or they were built by someone with the capability to construct beneath ice sheets using techniques we don't understand. The largest structure complex documented on the maps covered an area of approximately 12 square kilometers. It consisted of multiple interconnected buildings or facilities, arranged in a geometric pattern that suggested deliberate urban planning. The structures showed evidence of multiple levels, with some portions extending deep underground, while others rose to heights that would have been visible above ground before ice accumulation buried them. The expedition's architects, who analyzed the structure's design, noted in their reports that the construction showed principles of load distribution and stress management that were more sophisticated than contemporary engineering practice. Another structure documented on the maps was particularly striking. It was a circular formation approximately 800 meters in diameter, with walls that the expedition estimated to be at least 40 meters thick. The structure appeared to be a single unified construction rather than assembled from individual blocks, suggesting either an enormous level of coordinated construction effort or the use of building techniques that could create massive structures as unified wholes. The interior of this circular structure showed geometric patterns that the expedition's analysts could not determine the purpose of. Patterns of channels or passages that radiated from a central point in mathematically precise arrangements. The maps also documented smaller structures scattered across the surveyed region. These showed more variation in design, suggesting either different time periods of construction, different purposes, or possibly different builders. Some were rectangular buildings that could plausibly be interpreted as residential or administrative facilities. Others had unusual shapes that didn't match any conventional architectural tradition, curved walls forming structures that were neither purely circular nor rectangular, but followed more complex geometric principles. What made these maps particularly valuable was the detail of the annotations. The German expedition didn't just draw the structures, they documented observations about their condition, about the materials they appeared to be constructed from, and about any features that were accessible for direct examination. Yet the annotations described stone that was harder than granite and showed no weathering despite apparent great age. They described surfaces that were unnaturally smooth, as though polished by unknown processes. And in several cases they described symbols or markings on the structures that appeared to be writing or notation in an unknown system. One particularly detailed annotation describes an entrance to one of the structures that the expedition was able to access through an ice cave. The entrance led to a corridor that extended beyond the range that the expedition could safely explore with their available equipment. But in the portion they did explore, they found walls covered with carved symbols and what appeared to be pictographic representations. The expedition photographed these symbols. and the photographs were included in the classified archives. Dr. Christensen's sources showed her some of these photographs. The symbols were unlike any known ancient writing system, displaying characteristics that suggested sophistication and purpose, but that have never been successfully translated. The maps show approximately 40 distinct structures or structure complexes across the region the expedition surveyed. Each structure is documented with the same level of detail, suggesting that the expedition spent considerable time and effort on this documentation. The dedication of resources to mapping these structures, resources that came at the expense of the expedition's official geographical and resource survey objectives, demonstrates that the Nazi leadership considered these structures to be of extreme importance. The Neuschwabenland expedition returned to Germany in April of 1939, 5 months before Germany would invade Poland and initiate World War II. The expedition brought back thousands of photographs, extensive survey data, biological and geological samples, and most importantly, the maps and documentation of the structures they had found. The materials were delivered to German authorities, who immediately classified them at the highest level of security. Even within the Nazi government and military, access to the full expedition findings was restricted to a very small group. What happened to the maps and documentation during the war years is partially obscure. We know that copies were distributed to several different agencies and research institutions within Germany, presumably to allow multiple groups to analyze the findings and develop recommendations for how to exploit what had been discovered. We know that planning began for follow-up expeditions that would be better equipped to access and study the structures, though these expeditions were apparently never conducted due to the demands of the war. And we know that at least one set of the maps and documents was kept in a secure facility in Berlin. As the war turned against Germany and as Allied forces began advancing toward Berlin in early 1945, German authorities made efforts to prevent certain sensitive materials from falling into Allied hands. Some materials were destroyed, others were moved to secure locations in southern Germany or Austria. And some materials, including portions of the Antarctic expedition documentation, were apparently moved out of Germany entirely, smuggled to neutral countries, or to locations in South America where German assets had been positioned. The maps and documents that remained in Germany were captured by Allied forces when Berlin fell in May 1945. The materials were discovered by American intelligence officers conducting surveys of German research facilities. The discovery was made not by frontline troops, but by specialized intelligence units, specifically teams from the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which was the wartime predecessor to the CIA. These teams had been briefed on what to look for in German archives, suggesting that Allied intelligence already had some awareness of the Antarctic expedition's discoveries, possibly through signals intelligence or through informants within the German government. The captured materials were immediately classified by American authorities. They were not shared with the broader Allied coalition and were not turned over to international bodies that were being established to oversee captured German scientific and technological materials. Instead, they were placed under the control of what would become the CIA and were designated as matters of national security at the highest classification levels. British intelligence also obtained copies of some materials, apparently through intelligence sharing arrangements with the Americans, and these copies were similarly classified by British authorities. Soviet forces also captured German Antarctic materials, though the exact extent of what they obtained is unclear. Yet Soviet intelligence was very active in Berlin during the final days of the war and in the immediate post-war period, and they were specifically targeting German research facilities and archives. It's reasonable to assume they obtained at least some of the expedition documentation. Soviet Antarctic activities in subsequent decades suggest they had knowledge of the structures, though they never publicly acknowledged this knowledge. The suppression of the German Antarctic discoveries continued through the post-war decades. When international cooperation in Antarctic research began in the 1950s, culminating in the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, the nations that possessed the German documentation did not share it with the broader international community. The treaty established Antarctica as a scientific preserve and created mechanisms for coordinating research, But it also, perhaps not coincidentally, created restrictions on certain types of activities and on access to certain regions. These restrictions could be used to prevent investigation of the locations where structures had been documented. Through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, various nations conducted Antarctic research that occasionally produced observations consistent with the German findings. Anomalous radar returns suggesting subsurface structures, unusual heat signatures in ice-covered regions, and unexplained magnetic anomalies were detected and documented in scientific literature. But these observations were never connected publicly to the German maps. Yes, and they were typically explained as geological peculiarities rather than evidence of artificial structures. Scientists who pushed too hard to investigate these anomalies found their funding cut, their research restricted, or their findings suppressed through peer review processes that suddenly became extraordinarily skeptical of any conclusions that challenged conventional understanding. The suppression was systematic and effective. For over 70 years, the information that a German expedition in 1938 had documented artificial structures in Antarctica remained hidden from public awareness. Only a small group of individuals within intelligence and defense establishments knew the truth, and they worked continuously to ensure that independent discovery of the structures, which became increasingly likely as technology improved, would be controlled and managed rather than becoming public knowledge that could force uncomfortable questions about history, about Antarctica, and about what might still exist beneath the ice. One of the most disturbing aspects of the structures documented in the German maps is not just their existence or their age, but the sophistication of the technology and engineering principles they display. The German expedition's analysts, who included professional architects and engineers, recognized immediately that what they were observing represented capabilities far exceeding anything known from ancient civilizations. The structures incorporated design principles that suggested understanding of advanced physics, mathematics, and engineering that shouldn't have existed in any prehistoric period. Dr. Christensen, in her investigation of the German documentation, obtained access to technical analyses that had been conducted on the structure's design characteristics. These analyses, performed initially by German experts in 1939 and 40, and later updated by American analysts after the war, identified several specific technological features that were particularly noteworthy. The first was the construction material itself. Based on samples that the German expedition was able to collect from exposed portions of structures, and based on analysis of photographs showing surface textures and weathering patterns, the structures appeared to be built from a material that was not natural stone. And the material showed characteristics of being synthetic or manufactured, a composite of multiple substances bound together in ways that created properties superior to any single natural material. The material was extraordinarily hard, resistant to weathering, and appeared to have been formed rather than carved, suggesting it was poured or molded in place during construction. Modern materials science would eventually develop similar composites, but the techniques required for creating them at the scale evident in the Antarctic structures wouldn't be available to human civilization until the late 20th century. The second notable feature was the precision of construction. The structures showed tolerances in alignment and fitting that exceeded what manual construction techniques should be able to achieve. End walls were perfectly vertical to within fractions of a degree. Corners met at precise right angles. Individual components fit together with gaps measured in millimeters or less. This level of precision suggested either extremely sophisticated measurement and construction tools or construction methods that allowed for accuracy beyond what manual placement and adjustment could achieve. The third feature was the structural engineering principles evident in the designs. The buildings incorporated load-bearing techniques that distributed weight in ways that minimized stress on individual structural elements. The techniques showed understanding of principles that modern engineering recognizes as optimal for earthquake resistance, for handling thermal expansion and contraction, and for maintaining structural integrity over extremely long time periods. Some of the design features documented in the German maps weren't developed in modern engineering until decades after the expedition, yet they appeared in structures that were already ancient when the Germans found them. Perhaps most significantly, some of the structures showed evidence of having incorporated functional systems beyond simple shelter or storage. The annotations on the German maps describe channels and passages within the structures that appeared designed for circulation of fluids or gases. The patterns these channels followed suggested sophisticated understanding of fluid dynamics and thermal management. In modern buildings, similar patterns are used for heating, cooling, and ventilation systems, but implementing such systems requires pumps, ducting, and control mechanisms that shouldn't have been available to ancient civilizations. The circular structure I mentioned earlier, the 800-meter diameter formation, showed particularly advanced characteristics. The geometric pattern of passages radiating from its center matched mathematical principles that weren't formally described until the development of fractal geometry in the 20th century. The pattern suggested it might have served as some kind of distribution or processing facility, taking something from a central point and distributing it through the radial passages according to principles that optimized flow and minimized resistance. American analysts who studied the German documentation after the war became particularly interested in determining whether the structures might have incorporated energy generation or storage systems. Some features documented in the maps were consistent with designs that could concentrate or channel electromagnetic fields, could create resonance patterns in structures subjected to vibrational energy, or could store electrical charge in configurations similar to large-scale capacitors. Whether these design features were intentional, whether the structures were designed to process energy, or whether they were simply architectural choices that coincidentally matched patterns that modern technology would later discover for energy applications, remained uncertain. But the possibility that ancient structures in Antarctica incorporated advanced energy technology was taken seriously enough that it influenced subsequent Antarctic research priorities. The technology evident in the structures suggested several possibilities about their origin. They could have been built by an advanced human civilization that existed before recorded history and that possessed knowledge subsequently lost during whatever catastrophe led to their burial beneath ice. They could have been built by non-human intelligence, either terrestrial or extraterrestrial, that had capabilities exceeding human development. Or they could represent technology from a parallel development of human civilization, a lineage that evolved independently, and that reached heights we're only now beginning to match before disappearing from history. Whatever the origin, the technology was real, documented in detailed maps and photographs, analyzed by professional engineers who recognized its sophistication, and confirmed decades later by satellite observations that showed the structures were still there, and in some cases were still displaying activity in the form of thermal emissions. The structures represented not just historical curiosities, but potential sources of knowledge that could dramatically advance human technological capability if they could be accessed and studied. And that potential, that possibility of recovering ancient technology, became one of the driving forces behind the continued suppression of information about their existence. Dr. Elena Christensen's discovery of geometric heat signatures matching the 1938 German maps was not the first time that modern technology had detected the Antarctic structures. Throughout the decades since satellite remote sensing became available, various systems have produced data showing anomalies consistent with artificial structures beneath the ice. Each discovery has been noted, classified, and suppressed, but as satellite technology has become more sophisticated and more widely available, suppression has become increasingly difficult. The first satellite detection of Antarctic structural anomalies occurred in the 1970s when American surveillance satellites, designed primarily for military reconnaissance but also used for Earth observation, detected unusual radar returns from certain Antarctic regions. Yet the returns showed geometric patterns that didn't match natural geological formations. The discoveries were noted in classified reports but were not pursued for further investigation, officially due to the low priority of Antarctic surveillance compared to other global intelligence requirements, but more likely due to deliberate decisions to avoid confirming what the German maps had already documented. In the 1990s, as commercial satellite imagery became available and as scientific remote sensing improved, more anomalies were detected. Synthetic aperture radar, which can create detailed images of terrain beneath ice, revealed formations that some analysts interpreted as potentially artificial. These formations were scattered across Antarctica, with concentrations in several specific regions, including East Antarctica, the region near the Transantarctic Mountains, and portions of West Antarctica near the Ross Ice Shelf. The thermal imaging data that Dr. Christensen analyzed represents the most recent and most detailed detection of the structures. Modern infrared sensors can detect minute temperature differences across large areas, and they can distinguish between heat sources that are geothermal, volcanic, or potentially artificial. The 14 geometric heat signatures that Christensen identified show thermal characteristics that are difficult to explain through natural processes. They emit consistent low-level heat in patterns that remain stable over years of observation. They show temperature distributions that are more uniform than what geothermal sources typically produce, and most tellingly, their locations match almost perfectly with structures documented on the 1938 German maps. Christensen's discovery prompted a classified review of all available satellite data related to these locations. The review, conducted by intelligence agencies and scientific institutions that have security clearances for sensitive Antarctic information, confirmed that the structures are real, that they extend across substantial areas of Antarctica, and that at least some of them are displaying measurable activity in the form of heat emission, and in some cases electromagnetic radiation that specialized satellites can detect. The review also identified additional structures beyond the 14 that Christensen had initially detected. Using more sophisticated analysis techniques and examining data from multiple satellite systems, an analyst identified over 50 distinct locations showing characteristics consistent with buried artificial structures. The structures vary in size from relatively small facilities of a few hundred square meters to massive complexes covering multiple square kilometers. They're distributed across Antarctica, but show clustering in specific regions, suggesting they may be part of organized networks or systems rather than isolated independent facilities. One particularly intriguing finding from the satellite analysis is that several of the structures appear to be connected by linear features that extend for dozens of kilometers beneath the ice. These linear features show up in radar data as regions of anomalous ice density, suggesting that something beneath the ice is affecting how the ice forms or flows. The features could be roads, to tunnels, pipelines, or some other form of connection between structures, indicating that what exists beneath the Antarctic ice is not just scattered buildings, but an integrated infrastructure system. The satellite data has also revealed that the structures are not uniformly buried. Some are beneath several kilometers of ice, requiring the ice sheet to have accumulated over them across immense time periods. Others are much closer to the surface, beneath only a few hundred meters of ice, suggesting they were either built more recently or in locations where ice accumulation has been slower. A few structures appear to be partially exposed in regions where wind or geothermal activity has prevented ice from accumulating. Though these exposed portions are in locations so remote and inaccessible that direct human investigation has not yet occurred. The modern satellite confirmations of the German maps have created a dilemma for the institutions that have been suppressing this information. The technology is becoming too good and too widely available to prevent detection. Independent researchers, amateur satellite analysts, and even artificial intelligence systems analyzing publicly available satellite data are beginning to identify the anomalies. The question is no longer whether the structures can be kept secret indefinitely, but rather how to manage the disclosure when it becomes impossible to maintain the suppression. The German expedition of 1938 was not the last organized effort to investigate the Antarctic structures. Yet throughout the decades since that expedition, multiple nations have conducted operations to verify, study, and in some cases attempt to access the structures that the German maps documented. These expeditions have been conducted under various covers: official scientific research programs, military training exercises, resource surveys, all providing plausible explanations for activities that were actually focused on the ancient structures. The first significant post-war expedition was American, conducted in 1946 and 47 under the designation Operation High Jump. This operation has been the subject of considerable speculation and conspiracy theorizing over the decades, with claims ranging from the plausible to the bizarre about its true purposes. The official mission was to establish American presence in Antarctica, to conduct training in polar conditions, and to test equipment and techniques for cold weather operations. But the scale of the operation, which included over 4,000 military personnel, multiple ships, and extensive air support, far exceeded what these official objectives would require. Declassified documents have revealed that Operation High Jump included objectives related to investigating specific Antarctic locations that had been identified from captured German documentation. The operation conducted aerial surveys using sophisticated camera equipment, ground surveys in several coastal regions, and attempted to access subsurface areas through drilling and excavation. The operation was originally scheduled to last 6 months, but was terminated after only 8 weeks. With official explanations citing weather conditions and equipment failures, but with persistent rumors suggesting the operation encountered something unexpected that prompted early withdrawal. Admiral Richard Byrd, who commanded Operation High Jump, gave several interviews after the operation in which he made cryptic statements about America needing to defend against threats that could come from the polar region, statements that have been endlessly analyzed and interpreted, but that were never fully explained. Byrd's personal papers, portions of which were released decades after his death, include references to discoveries made during High Jump that were immediately classified and that remained classified through his lifetime. What those discoveries were has never been officially disclosed. But researchers who have examined the available evidence believe Operation High Jump confirmed the existence and locations of the structures that the German maps documented. Soviet expeditions to Antarctica in the 1950s and 60s also had classified objectives related to investigating subsurface structures. The Soviets established several research stations in Antarctica, with locations chosen not just for scientific accessibility, but for proximity to regions where structures had been detected or suspected. Soviet researchers conducted extensive ice drilling operations, officially to study ice cores and climate history, but in several cases drilling to depths and locations that were inconsistent with purely scientific objectives. One Soviet operation in 1961 reached a depth of over 3,000 meters at a location in East Antarctica. The drilling encountered an obstacle at that depth that stopped progress and reportedly damaged the drilling equipment. Soviet records describe the obstacle as an unusually hard rock formation, but analysis of drill core samples showed material that was not consistent with natural rock. The samples showed characteristics similar to the construction material that the German expedition had described in their annotations, suggesting the Soviets had drilled into one of the buried structures. The drilling site was sealed and abandoned, and subsequent Soviet operations in Antarctica avoided that specific location. British expeditions also conducted investigations, though on smaller scales than American or Soviet operations. British researchers have long maintained presence in Antarctica through the British Antarctic Survey and have conducted extensive geological and glaciological research. Some of this research has been in regions where structures are located, and British archives contain references to anomalous findings that were classified rather than published. British intelligence has maintained coordination with American counterparts on Antarctic matters, suggesting shared knowledge and shared suppression of information about the structures. In more recent decades, as international cooperation in Antarctica has increased and as more nations have established research programs on the continent, the number of expeditions encountering evidence of the structures has increased proportionally. Chinese Antarctic research, which has expanded rapidly since the 1980s, has included operations in regions where structures are located. Chinese researchers have reported findings consistent with artificial structures beneath the ice, though these findings have been shared only in classified channels rather than in open scientific literature. The pattern across all these expeditions is consistent. Nations investigate the regions where structures are known or suspected to exist. They conduct surveys and in some cases attempt direct access through drilling or excavation. When they confirm the existence of structures or when they encounter evidence that challenges conventional understanding of Antarctic history, they classify the findings and suppress public disclosure. The coordinated international suppression suggests either formal agreements among nations to keep the structures secret or informal understanding that disclosing the truth would raise questions none of the governments are prepared to answer about history, about ancient technology, and about what might still be accessible beneath the Antarctic ice. The question that Dr. Elena Christensen found most troubling in her investigation was not what exists beneath the Antarctic ice, but why its existence continues to be suppressed. The structures have been known to various governments since at least 1938. They've been confirmed through multiple expeditions over 8 decades. Modern satellite technology is making them increasingly impossible to hide, yet the suppression continues with classified security restrictions. With denial of research proposals that would investigate the anomalies too closely, and with active efforts to debunk or discredit anyone who suggests that artificial structures exist beneath Antarctic ice. Why? The answers Dr. Christensen pieced together from her research and from conversations with sources who have knowledge of classified Antarctic programs suggest multiple overlapping motivations for continued suppression. The first motivation is epistemological, relating to how we understand human history and civilization. If ancient structures exist in Antarctica that predate known human civilization by tens or hundreds of thousands of years, then the fundamental narrative of human development is wrong. We've been taught that civilization emerged approximately 10,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and independently in a few other locations, and that technological development has been essentially linear with occasional setbacks, but overall progress from primitive to modern states. Ancient Antarctic structures demonstrating sophisticated technology challenges this narrative completely. They suggest that advanced civilizations existed long before the accepted timeline, that they possessed capabilities we've only recently redeveloped, and that they disappeared through catastrophes or other processes leaving only buried evidence of their existence. Acknowledging this truth would require rewriting history textbooks, revising archaeological and anthropological theories, and admitting that academic institutions have been fundamentally wrong about human origins and development for over a century. The resistance to such wholesale revision of established narratives is enormous, even when evidence demands it. The second motivation is geopolitical. Antarctica is governed by the Antarctic Treaty, which was established in 1959 and which designated the continent as a scientific preserve prohibiting military activity and territorial claims. But the treaty also includes provisions about resource exploitation, and there's considerable strategic interest in Antarctica's potential mineral, energy, and other resources. If ancient structures exist beneath the ice and if they contain technology or materials of strategic value, and then nations that have knowledge of these structures have incentives to prevent broader awareness that would create competition for access. The structures themselves might contain materials, artifacts, or information of immense value. Technology from an advanced ancient civilization could provide breakthroughs in energy generation, materials science, construction techniques, or other areas that would convey enormous economic and military advantages to whichever nation could access and exploit them first. The German expedition of 1938 was conducted partially with this motivation, seeking ancient knowledge that could contribute to German power. Modern nations have similar motivations. Each perhaps more cautious about direct exploitation, but certainly interested in understanding what the structures might contain before allowing broader international access. The third motivation is about control of the narrative around non-human intelligence. If the structures were built by humans, even humans from an unknown ancient civilization, that's one thing. But if they were built by non-human intelligence, whether terrestrial or extraterrestrial, then disclosure requires confronting questions about our place in the universe, about whether Earth has been visited or inhabited by non-human intelligence, and about what relationship such intelligence might have to human civilization. These questions challenge religious, philosophical, and scientific frameworks in ways that institutions have historically resisted. Yet the structure's characteristics, particularly the advanced technology they display, make the non-human intelligence hypothesis difficult to dismiss entirely. If humans built them, those humans possessed capabilities far exceeding what we attribute to any known ancient civilization. If non-humans built them, then we must confront the reality that intelligence beyond humanity has been active on Earth, potentially for far longer than humans have existed. Either conclusion is profoundly disturbing to established worldviews, and institutions that benefit from maintaining those worldviews have strong incentives to prevent the questions from being asked. Dr. Christensen concluded from her investigation that the suppression cannot continue indefinitely. Technology is improving too rapidly. There's too many independent researchers are detecting the anomalies, and the Antarctic ice is melting at accelerating rates that will eventually expose structures currently buried beneath it. Within decades, possibly within years, the truth will become impossible to hide. The question is not whether disclosure will occur, but how it will be managed when it becomes unavoidable. Some within the intelligence and scientific communities that know the truth are advocating for controlled disclosure, gradually releasing information in ways that allow public understanding to develop without shock or panic. Others argue for continuing suppression as long as possible, hoping that by the time exposure occurs, the institutions responsible for the suppression will no longer be directly accountable. Still others, and including some who have reached out to researchers like Dr. Christensen, believe the information should be released immediately, that the public has a right to know what exists beneath the Antarctic ice, regardless of how disturbing or paradigm challenging that knowledge might be. The German maps from 1938, the maps that show impossible structures in locations where nothing should exist, are not historical curiosities. They're evidence of one of the most significant discoveries in human history, a discovery that has been suppressed for over 8 decades, but that cannot be suppressed much longer. Modern satellites are confirming what the Germans documented. The ice is melting, and the structures beneath it, structures that have waited in frozen darkness for unknown periods of time, are going to be revealed whether governments want them to be or not. When that revelation occurs, when the structures are photographed clearly from space, when researchers can access them directly and study what they contain, humanity will be forced to confront questions that have been avoided for nearly a century. What civilization built them? When? Why in Antarctica? What capabilities did they possess? What happened to them? And most importantly, what knowledge or technology might still exist within the structures waiting to be discovered? Among the most intriguing elements documented in the 1938 German maps are the symbols and markings that expedition members observed on the structures they were able to access. Yet these symbols appear in the expedition's photographic record and are described in detailed annotations that accompanied the maps. The symbols represent one of the greatest mysteries within the already mysterious context of the Antarctic structures, because they suggest not just architectural capability, but also written language, information storage, and possibly advanced systems of knowledge that remain completely inaccessible to modern understanding. The German expedition photographed symbol sequences from several locations where they gained access to structure interiors, or where symbols were visible on exposed exterior surfaces. The photographs show carved or inscribed markings arranged in linear sequences that suggest written text. Though the structure and organization of the symbols differs fundamentally from any known writing system, the symbols themselves are geometric in character, combinations of lines, circles, curves, and more complex shapes that appear to follow consistent rules of formation and combination. When the photographs reached Germany and were analyzed by linguists and cryptographers, the response was immediate fascination and frustration. The symbols clearly represented some form of information encoding, but they didn't match any known ancient writing system. They weren't Egyptian hieroglyphics, Sumerian cuneiform, Chinese characters, or any variant of alphabetic or syllabic writing from known civilizations. The structural principles underlying the symbol system appeared to be fundamentally different from how human languages typically encode information in written form. One linguistic analyst who examined the German photographs in the immediate post-war period, whose report Dr. Christensen obtained from declassified archives, noted several unusual characteristics of the symbol system. First, the symbols showed what he called excessive redundancy, with certain symbol combinations appearing far more frequently than statistical analysis of normal written language would predict. Second, the symbols appeared to be organized in nested hierarchical structures, with larger symbols containing or enclosing smaller symbols in patterns that suggested complex relationships rather than simple linear sequences. Third, the symbols showed mathematical regularity, with spacing, sizing, and angular relationships following precise ratios and geometric proportions. These characteristics suggested to the analyst that the symbols might not represent spoken language translated into written form, which is how most human writing systems function, but might instead represent a more abstract form of information encoding, possibly mathematical or logical relationships, possibly technical instructions or data storage, or possibly a form of writing that doesn't rely on language as humans understand it. The analyst concluded that deciphering the symbols would require understanding not just the code, but the entire conceptual framework that generated it, a framework that might be fundamentally alien to human cognition. Thus, American cryptographers who examined the symbols after the war spent years attempting to decipher them using techniques that had been successful with other unknown writing systems. They analyzed symbol frequencies, looked for repeated patterns, attempted to identify mathematical relationships, and tried to correlate symbols with possible meanings based on their contexts within structures. None of these approaches produced definitive results. The symbol system remained opaque, revealing tantalizing hints of structure and meaning, but never yielding to comprehensive decipherment. In the 1990s, the photographs of the symbols were subjected to computer analysis using pattern recognition algorithms and statistical methods that weren't available to earlier researchers. Yet the analysis confirmed that the symbols did contain information, that they showed statistical properties inconsistent with random decoration, and that they appeared to encode content with complexity, suggesting substantial information density. But the analysis also revealed something troubling. The symbol system showed characteristics of what information theorists call optimal encoding, a level of efficiency in representing information that human writing systems rarely achieve because they evolved through historical processes rather than being designed for maximum efficiency. The near-optimal efficiency of the symbol encoding suggested it was designed rather than evolved. Created by intelligence that understood information theory principles and that constructed a writing system to maximize information density and minimize redundancy while maintaining decodability. Human writing systems tend to have considerable redundancy, allowing readers to understand text even with missing or corrupted portions. The Antarctic symbols showed minimal redundancy while maintaining apparent coherence, a balance that would require sophisticated understanding of information and communication principles. Dr. Christensen's investigation revealed that attempts to decipher the symbols have continued in classified programs through to the present day. Modern artificial intelligence systems, particularly those trained on pattern recognition and language analysis, have been applied to the problem with some interesting results. AI analysis has identified what appear to be grammatical structures within the symbol sequences, repeated patterns that suggest rules governing symbol combinations. The AI has also identified possible semantic groupings, clusters of related symbols that might represent conceptual categories or thematic relationships, but translation remains elusive. Without a Rosetta Stone, without any parallel text in a known language that would allow correlation of symbols with meanings, decipherment of the Antarctic symbols faces fundamental limitations. The AI systems can identify patterns and structures, but they cannot assign definitive meanings to symbols without external reference points. Some researchers have proposed attempting to use context, the locations of symbol sequences within structures, to infer possible meanings. Now, assuming that symbols near entrances might relate to access or warning, symbols in central chambers might relate to function or purpose, and so forth. But these contextual interpretations remain highly speculative. The symbols represent not just an intellectual puzzle, but a potentially crucial key to understanding the structures themselves. If the symbols could be deciphered, they might reveal the purpose of the structures, the identity of their builders, the history of their construction and use, and possibly instructions for accessing technology or knowledge that the structures might contain. The symbols might also reveal whether the builders still exist somewhere, whether they left Earth or died out, and whether they intended the structures to be found and understood by whoever might eventually discover them. Yet the German expedition's limited access to the structures in 1938 meant they photographed only a small fraction of the symbols that likely exist. If structures could be fully accessed and explored, researchers might find longer symbol sequences, repeated texts that would help identify patterns, or possibly symbolic keys that would explain the system structure. Until such access becomes possible, the symbols remain one more tantalizing mystery within the larger mystery of the Antarctic structures, evidence of sophisticated intelligence that created not just buildings, but information systems we cannot yet comprehend. Beyond the architectural sophistication and the undecipherable symbols, the Antarctic structures present another category of mystery that has profound implications for our understanding of materials science and ancient technological capabilities. The materials from which the structures are constructed, based on samples collected by the German expedition and by subsequent operations, display properties that challenge conventional understanding of what ancient civilization should have been capable of producing. The primary construction material, samples of which were analyzed initially by German researchers and later by American and Soviet scientists who obtained German samples after the war, is unlike any natural stone or any known ancient building material. Microscopic analysis shows it to be a composite, combining multiple mineral components in a matrix that appears to have been formed through high temperature and high pressure processes. The composition is not random but precisely controlled, with different mineral phases distributed in patterns that optimize the material's structural properties. Modern material scientists examining the samples have noted that the composite structure resembles advanced ceramics and cermets, materials that combine ceramic and metallic components to achieve properties superior to either material alone. But producing such materials requires temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius, pressures of thousands of atmospheres, and precise control of composition and processing conditions. These capabilities should not have existed in any prehistoric period. Yet the Antarctic structure materials display characteristics indicating they were manufactured using processes at least as sophisticated as modern advanced materials production. The material's properties are remarkable. It has compressive strength exceeding high-grade concrete by factors of 3 to 5. It shows virtually no water absorption, meaning it's highly resistant to freeze-thaw damage that destroys most building materials in cold climates. It displays thermal conductivity properties that are unusual, conducting heat more efficiently than stone, but less efficiently than metals, suggesting it might have been designed to manage thermal flows within structures. And perhaps most significantly, it shows no degradation despite apparent extreme age, no weathering, no erosion, and no chemical breakdown that would be expected in materials exposed to environmental conditions for thousands of years. One particular sample that German researchers analyzed showed something even more anomalous. The sample appeared to contain embedded fibers, microscopic threads of a different material running through the composite matrix. The fibers were metallic in composition, but showed crystalline structures that don't occur in naturally formed metals. Analysis suggested the fibers might have been deliberately incorporated during manufacturing to enhance the material's tensile strength, functioning similarly to how steel reinforcing bars strengthen modern concrete. But the sophistication of this reinforcement, the precision with which the fibers were distributed and oriented, implied manufacturing capabilities far exceeding ancient technology. American researchers who examined German samples after the war attempted to reproduce the material using modern techniques. They were able to create composites with some similar properties using high-temperature furnaces and hydraulic presses, but they could not match all characteristics of the Antarctic material, particularly the embedded fiber reinforcement and the material's extreme durability. The conclusion was that whoever created the original material either used manufacturing processes more advanced than mid-20th century technology or used fundamentally different approaches that modern materials science hadn't discovered. Soviet materials scientists conducted similar experiments with similar results. Yet they succeeded in creating partial analogs but could not reproduce the Antarctic material completely. Some Soviet researchers proposed that the material might have been manufactured using energy sources or processing methods that don't exist in modern industrial production. possibly electromagnetic or acoustic processing that could manipulate material structure at molecular or atomic scales without requiring extreme bulk temperatures and pressures. These proposals were speculative, but represented attempts to explain how advanced materials could have been manufactured in prehistory. The materials used in the structures aren't uniform. Different areas show different material compositions, suggesting either different construction phases, different builders, or deliberate use of different materials for different structural purposes. As some materials are denser and harder, appropriate for load-bearing elements. Others are lighter and show better thermal insulation properties, appropriate for walls or partitions. The variation suggests not just advanced materials manufacturing, but sophisticated materials engineering, understanding of how different material properties serve different structural functions. Another intriguing characteristic of some material samples is their interaction with electromagnetic fields. Several samples show unusual magnetic properties, maintaining weak magnetization even in the absence of external magnetic fields. Other samples show electrical conductivity that varies with temperature in ways that suggest they might have semiconducting properties. But these electromagnetic characteristics hint that some structural materials might have served dual purposes, providing structural support while also functioning as components in electrical or electromagnetic systems within the buildings. Dr. Christensen's sources provided her with information about recent materials analysis using techniques that weren't available to earlier researchers. Neutron scattering and synchrotron X-ray analysis of Antarctic structure samples have revealed atomic-scale features that provide additional insights into how the materials were manufactured. The analysis shows that the materials have extremely uniform grain structures, with crystalline domains aligned in patterns that would require very careful control of cooling rates and thermal gradients during formation. Yet the uniformity suggests manufacturing processes that could maintain precise temperature control across large material volumes, capabilities that even modern industrial processes struggle to achieve. The materials science mystery is not just academic. If the manufacturing processes used to create the Antarctic structure materials could be understood and reproduced, the implications for modern construction, aerospace, electronics, and numerous other fields would be revolutionary. Materials with the strength, durability, and multifunctional properties of the Antarctic samples would enable construction projects currently impossible, would allow structures to last for geological timescales with minimal maintenance, and might enable integration of structural and functional systems in ways that would transform architecture and engineering. But the knowledge of how to produce these materials appears to have been lost, if it ever existed within human civilization. The materials remain as evidence of sophisticated capabilities whose origins we cannot determine and whose methods we cannot replicate. They stand as silent testimony to intelligence that understood materials science at levels we're only beginning to approach. Intelligence that left behind structures built to last for time frames that dwarf the entire span of recorded human history. Dr. Elena Christensen's investigation into the German Antarctic maps and the structures they documented led her to a sobering conclusion about timing. Antarctica is changing rapidly due to climate change, with ice sheet mass loss accelerating each year. Yet regions that have been ice-covered for millennia are becoming exposed as glaciers retreat and ice shelves collapse. Within the lifetime of people currently alive, significant portions of Antarctica that are currently buried will be exposed to direct observation. And when that exposure occurs, when the structures documented in the 1938 German maps become visible from satellite imagery or become accessible to direct human investigation, the suppression that has lasted for over 8 decades will become impossible to maintain. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and various glaciological research programs have produced models of Antarctic ice loss under different climate scenarios. Even under the most conservative scenarios, substantial ice retreat will occur across Antarctica over the coming decades. But under more aggressive warming scenarios, the changes will be dramatic. Regions of East Antarctica, where some of the largest structure complexes are located, will see ice sheet thinning measured in hundreds of meters. The structures currently buried under 2 kilometers of ice might be under 1 kilometer of ice by 2060 and under half a kilometer by the end of the century. At certain thresholds of ice thickness, the structures will become detectable using radar and seismic methods that don't require ice penetration. At thinner thresholds, excavation to reach structures becomes feasible using conventional drilling and mining technology. And at some locations where structures are closer to the current ice surface, complete exposure through ice melt is possible within decades rather than centuries. Yet the timeline for revelation is not distant future but near-term present, creating urgent questions about how the disclosure will be managed when it can no longer be prevented. Governments and intelligence agencies that possess classified knowledge about the structures are presumably planning for this eventuality. Dr. Christensen's sources suggested that discussions have been ongoing within select groups about how to handle public awareness when structures become undeniable. Some advocate for preemptive controlled disclosure, releasing information gradually to prepare public understanding before complete revelation forces abrupt acknowledgement. Others argue for maintaining denial as long as possible, hoping that institutional memory and personnel changes will distance current authorities from responsibility for the decades of suppression. Yet there are also practical preparations occurring. Military and intelligence services from several nations have increased their Antarctic presence and capabilities in recent years, officially for scientific support and environmental monitoring, but practically positioned to control access to regions where structures are located. The Antarctic treaty mechanisms are being strengthened in ways that could be used to restrict access to specific areas once structures are exposed, with environmental protection and heritage preservation cited as justifications for limiting investigation to authorized organizations. Private commercial interests are also preparing. Several corporations and wealthy individuals with knowledge of or speculation about Antarctic structures have been positioning to gain access once revelation occurs. Some are funding Antarctic research programs that could provide legitimate cover for investigating structures. Others are developing technologies and capabilities for extreme environment operations that could be applied to Antarctic exploration and excavation. There appears to be anticipation of a rush for access and control once the structures are acknowledged, with various actors positioning to be first or most capable when that moment arrives. The scientific community, largely unaware of the classified knowledge about the structures, is unprepared for the paradigm shift that exposure will trigger. When structures are revealed and confirmed, when their sophistication and age become undeniable, nearly every field of science will be affected. Archaeology and anthropology will need to revise timelines and narratives of human civilization. So geology and glaciology will need to reconsider Antarctic climate history. Materials science and engineering will need to study construction techniques and materials that exceed modern capabilities. And broader questions about human origins, about possible non-human intelligence, about lost civilizations and catastrophic history will move from fringe speculation to mainstream scientific investigation. Public reaction is unpredictable but potentially destabilizing. Religious worldviews that position human civilization as recent and divinely guided will be challenged by evidence of sophisticated prehistoric or non-human construction. Political ideologies built on assumptions about technological and social progress may struggle to accommodate evidence that advanced civilization existed and disappeared. The economic systems based on resource extraction and technological development might face questions about whether ancient knowledge might make current industrial processes obsolete. The revelation would not just add information to existing understanding, but would force reconsideration of fundamental assumptions about history, about humanity's place in the world, and about the nature and trajectory of civilization. Dr. Christensen believes the revelation is inevitable, but that the details of how it unfolds will be critically important. If disclosure is managed carefully, if information is released gradually with context and with acknowledgement of uncertainty about many aspects of the structures, public understanding could develop in ways that are rational and constructive. If disclosure is forced suddenly through undeniable exposure, just if authorities are caught in obvious suppression and lies, public reaction could be more chaotic, with conspiracy theories, institutional distrust, and social disruption potentially resulting. What seems certain is that the German maps from 1938, the The maps that showed impossible structures in Antarctica will be vindicated. The structures they documented are real. They're being confirmed by modern satellite technology, and they're approaching exposure through ice melt that is accelerating beyond what any suppression can prevent. The truth about Antarctica, about what exists beneath the ice, about the sophistication of what's buried there, and the implications for understanding human history and technological capability is going to be forced into public awareness whether institutions want it to be or not. The only remaining question is whether that revelation will be managed in ways that allow constructive understanding, or whether it will be chaotic and destabilizing, forcing paradigm shifts without preparation or context. James Sullivan touched something impossible beneath Antarctic ice in 1958. Friedrich Wilhelm Hartmann mapped impossible structures in 1938. Dr. Elena Christensen detected thermal signatures from those same structures using satellite technology in 2021. Three individuals separated by decades and by different contexts, all encountering the same fundamental truth that has been suppressed for over 80 years, but that can no longer be hidden. Ancient structures exist beneath the Antarctic ice. The structures that demonstrate technological sophistication far exceeding what ancient civilization should have possessed. Structures that are still emitting energy after unknown periods of dormancy. Structures that respond to human contact in ways that suggest they were designed to interact with conscious beings. The complete truth about these structures remains unknown. We don't know definitively who built them, though the evidence suggests either an advanced prehistoric human civilization or non-human intelligence, terrestrial or extraterrestrial, that possess capabilities our current civilization is only beginning to match. We don't know exactly when they were built, though geological evidence about ice accumulation suggests timeframes measured in tens or hundreds of thousands of years. We don't know their purpose, though their size. Complexity and apparent technological functionality suggest they served more than simple shelter or storage. What we do know is that powerful institutions have known about these structures since at least 1938, that they have systematically suppressed information about them for over 80 years, that they have conducted classified investigations and operations to study and potentially exploit what the structures contain, and that they continue to deny or obfuscate their existence despite mounting evidence that makes suppression increasingly futile. The suppression represents one of the most significant and successful information control operations in modern history, spanning multiple nations, persisting across generations of personnel, and in maintaining coherence despite the massive expansion of satellite observation technology that has made Earth's surface increasingly transparent. But the suppression is ending. Climate change is melting the ice that has concealed the structures. Satellite technology is becoming too sophisticated and too widely available to prevent detection. Independent researchers like Dr. Christensen are connecting historical documentation with modern observations and are beginning to understand the scope of what's been hidden. And the individuals who have direct experience with the structures, people like Sullivan who touched them and were changed by them, have left testimony that provides first-hand evidence of what exists and what it can do. When the structures are fully revealed, when they can be studied openly rather than in classified programs, yet when their contents and their technology can be examined by the full resources of human scientific capability rather than by the limited personnel of secret operations, we will learn things that will force us to reconsider nearly everything we think we know about our planet's history and about the development of civilization and technology. We will learn whether we're the first technological civilization on Earth, or whether we're rebuilding after predecessors who reached heights we're only now approaching. We will learn whether intelligence beyond humanity has been active on Earth, whether as visitors from other worlds or as other terrestrial species that evolved in parallel with or before humans. And we will learn whether the knowledge and capabilities demonstrated in the Antarctic structures can be recovered. Yet whether ancient technology can be understood and applied, and whether that application would benefit humanity or would introduce risks we're unprepared to manage. The German maps from 1938 are not just historical documents. They're evidence of one of the most important discoveries in human history, a discovery that was immediately classified and has remained classified for over 8 decades despite its profound implications. They're proof that sophisticated structures exist where nothing should exist, that they display capabilities we don't fully understand, and that they represent knowledge and technology from civilizations or intelligence that predated our historical awareness. And they're proof that powerful institutions will suppress truth when that truth challenges fundamental narratives about history, about humanity's place in the world, and about the nature of civilization and progress. Friedrich Wilhelm Hartmann spent decades in silence, carrying knowledge he wasn't allowed to share, creating duplicate maps that he hid in hopes they would eventually reach people who could understand their significance. His maps survived. They're being validated by modern technology. And the structures they documented are approaching revelation whether suppression continues or not. The ice is melting. The truth is emerging. And the maps that showed impossible structures in 1938 are going to be recognized not as fantasies or forgeries, but as accurate documentation of one of the greatest mysteries our species has ever encountered. A mystery that's been buried beneath Antarctic ice, waiting for the moment when we would be technologically capable and perhaps psychologically ready to confront what it means to discover that we're not alone in our own history, that sophisticated intelligence has existed on Earth long before our recorded civilization began, and that the evidence of that intelligence is still there, still active, still waiting beneath the ice at the bottom of the world for us to finally acknowledge its existence and to begin understanding what it tells us about our past and possibly about our future.